Hello everyone! Welcome back to Franci Talks Asian Arts. I'm Franci and I'm back with a new video. Today's video is actually a video I wanted to make for a very long time, so I'm happy to be here recording it. And it's a video about Buddha, the historical Buddha Shakyamuni, about his life and how some of his life events have been pictured in sculpture. So we're going to look at sculptures which represent some specific events of Buddha's life, some pivotal moments. And at the same time, we are also going to talk about his teachings a little bit, so the foundations of the Buddhist religion. So I hope that this video can become a sort of introduction to Buddha, to Buddhism, and to Buddhist sculpture. Before we start, I just want to drop a quick reminder here that if you like the video, if you feel like it's been useful to you and you learned something, you can consider supporting the channel. There's different ways to do that, so you can just simply click like, you can share the video with a friend, you can of course subscribe to the channel if you want to see more, and you can also support me leaving me a tip through the website Ko-Fi. I will put the link in the description of this video. But for now, enough with the talking and let's jump right in. So let's start with a little introduction about the historical person of Buddha. He was not called Buddha, he was called Siddharta Gautama at birth, and he was born and raised in the area of the northern Indian subcontinent, which today coincides with Nepal. His dates of birth and death are generally indicated as 566 to 486 before Common Era. However, there's been a lot of research and discussions about this dating, and it could be said that 410 before Common Era is a more realistic date for his death. However, as you can imagine, these events happened so long in the past that it's hard to pinpoint exact datings. So here I would like to point out that following the life of Buddha also comes with uncertainties, because the texts which were written about his life were written actually starting 2 centuries after his death. In fact, at first, most knowledge about Buddhism was transmitted orally rather than textually. And also we have to keep in mind that some of the texts with time were embellished with more and more legendary details and events. So keep that in mind as we go through this video. Preparing this video, I've been using mostly a couple of sources, more than that, but 2 were the most fundamental ones. So the first one was Buddhism, a very short introduction by Damien Keown. This I had read before and I went back to it because I think it's a great introduction to Buddhism. It's academic, very straightforward, to the point, and explains Buddhist ideas very well. And the second one is the Encyclopedia of Buddhism, which was edited by Robert E. Buswell. And this is a mastodon of 1000 pages. Of course, I didn't read all of it, but it has in-depth text about all kinds of topics related to Buddhism. But let's go back to Buddha. As we mentioned, Buddha was called at his birth Siddharta Gautama, and actually Buddha was a name which was given to him later, as it means the enlightened one. So Buddha was born as Siddhartha to his mother Maya and his father Suddhodana, who was the leader of the clan of the Shakya, a clan who resided in the northeastern area of the Indian subcontinent. Sometimes you might notice Buddha is also called Shakyamuni. This means the sage of the Shakya. Now we have to say that Siddhartha's birth was nothing but extraordinary. In fact, his mother, before his birth, had a dream in which a white elephant entered her side, and this dream had been interpreted as a sign that her son was going to be either a great religious leader or a great emperor. Let's look at a small sculpture which pictures the birth of Buddha. It is the bronze Tanjō Shaka, a treasure from the Tōdaiji temple. Tanjō means birth in Japanese, and in fact here we see Siddharta just after being born. He is standing up, pointing up with his left arm and down with his right hand, declaring that he is the Lord of all that is above and below the heavens. And this is the last time that he is going to be born. This is opposed to the idea of rebirth, about which we are going to talk a little bit later. This sculpture was made in the Nara period, and this was a time in which this kind of format, this kind of style of sculpture was very popular. We can see that Buddha is wearing a simple draping skirt and is modeled with full shapes and curves, and he has a soft body. We should note that he is represented as an adult, and in fact it is said that he was born fully formed. He wasn't born as a regular child. We can also note that he presents some typical features of Buddha. For example, the curled up hair and elongated earlobes. We will talk about these characteristics also later in the video. When Siddharta was born, he was visited by the denizens of the heaven, and he was bathed in a miraculous shower of water which was falling from the heavens. This event is actually reflected in this sculpture, because in fact the sculpture is meant to stand in the middle of a basin. And on the occasion of Buddha's birthday, which in Japan is celebrated on the 8th of April, a ritual takes place in which water is poured over the sculpture and collected in the basin. According to religious texts, Siddhartha's life as a child was comfortable and easy. He lived in a beautiful and luxurious palace. He had an abundance of food and clothing, and he was surrounded by attendants who attended to his every need. And moreover, he was shielded from all negativity, from all negative elements of life. Eventually, Siddhartha grew up, he married, and he even had a child. But something about palace life must have felt unfulfilling, and in fact he decided to take some trips, some visits outside of the palace. On his first outing, he saw an old man, and on his second outing, he saw a sick man, and in his third outing, he actually saw a corpse being transported to the cremation location. These had been the first encounters that Siddhartha had with such tragic events of life, such as old age, sickness, and death. In general, the first encounters with the human condition, and they must have made a very strong impression on Siddhartha. In fact, he took one more trip outside his father's palace, and this time he saw a religious mendicant. And that day he decided that he as well was going to live his luxurious life, to become a mendicant, to seek for a spiritual solution to the difficulties of human life. And so that same night he did just that. He left his palace during the night and abandoned the life that he had known until that day. Now I just want to point out that in a very short introduction to Buddhism, Damien Keown actually makes an interesting point. That is that this part of the story may have been metaphorical. His life at the palace may be interpreted as a metaphor for complacency and self-delusion as a state of mind. And the palace's walls may also have been a metaphor, for example, for the barriers that we humans put up in our mind to avoid thinking of such tragic events such as sickness and death. Regardless of whether it was metaphorical or literal, Siddhartha's ignorance of such painful events of life had dissipated, and he had chosen the path of the samana. These were religious mendicants who lived in the Indian subcontinent, and they rejected a standard life in society, instead opting to live as mendicants and seek for higher religious purposes. From various teachers, Siddharta learned how to meditate. He actually learned how to enter a deep state of trance, to the point during meditation his own conscience was starting to disappear. And then from other teachers he started learning ascetic practices, which included exercises in breath control and limiting his own food. Ascetism is a discipline which calls for abstention from any type of indulgence, usually practiced for religious purposes. Let's look at a sculpture which is known as Buddha Leaving the Mountains. This pictures Buddha during this stage of life. The wooden statue we are looking at in particular, it's made of wood and it's about 100 centimeters tall. It pictures an emaciated Buddha who is walking supported by a stick, and his thin body is covered by draping robes. The sculpture managed to create a beautiful yet painful representation of this state as a renouncer. We can see how his ribs poke through his skin in the upper chest area. And if we look at his face, we can see how protruding his cheekbones are. His skin is tense all over his bones, which are peeking through because he is so thin. This is one of my favorite sculptures, one of my favorite types of representations in Buddhist art, because if we look at it, if we observe the statue for a little while, we can see that despite his bodily conditions, despite his thinness, we can see that Buddha, or at the time still Siddharta, he has a serene expression on his face. And even though he is holding a stick that is supporting him in his walking, Siddharta seems to be strong in his stance. He's taking a step. And this step is actually metaphorical as well. He is leaving the mountains. In fact, this was a pivotal moment in Siddhartha's life, because this is when he realized that putting his body through such harsh pain, through such ascetic practices, was not bearing any fruit. And he has in fact decided to abandon this kind of practices for good. At this point in life, Siddhartha needed a new path, and he decided to start a path based on moderation. He went back to his meditation practices, and in just one night, while sitting under a ficus tree, he attained the enlightenment. Before we can talk about what the enlightenment actually is, we need to take a step back and look at a belief which was widespread in the Indian subcontinent at the time, and that is the concept of rebirth. In fact, it was believed that all creatures do not simply live one life, but they're actually reborn after death. They are reincarnated. And this idea of rebirth was associated with the doctrine of karma, which basically entails that the circumstances of rebirth are actually determined by the moral quality of the deeds that one person performs during their life. This process of repeated rebirth is known with the term samsara, which means endless wandering, which makes us think of a constant movement, a constant cycle in which all creatures are involved until they manage to end it by attaining the enlightenment or nirvana. Throughout his night of meditation, Siddhartha acquired the power to see all his previous lives, recalling his previous existences in full detail. And then he acquired the power to see all previous lives, or all lives and deaths of all beings in the universe. And finally, he acquired the knowledge that all of his spiritual defilements had been eliminated, and that he had reached nirvana and broken the cycle of rebirth, as he had finally managed to root out, to eliminate from his life cravings and ignorance. It was at this moment that he had become the Buddha, the enlightened one. So let's look at another sculpture. In this case, we are looking at the sculpture of Buddha Tathāgata, as Buddha called himself after attaining the enlightenment. This name, Tathāgata, is the meaning it's kind of unclear. However, it is thought to mean either one who has thus gone or one who has thus come, and has been interpreted as signifying that the Buddha is beyond all coming and going, he is beyond all transitory phenomena. The sculpture is dated to the Heian period, and it was made out of one block of wood. We can see that in this work Buddha is represented seated, and his body is beautifully shaped with soft curves and volumes. He also has a peaceful face, and I also love how delicately his hands and his fingers have been sculpted. If we focus on his hands, we can see that they are represented in a very specific gesture. In fact, Buddhist sculptures are usually represented with specific hand gestures. These are called mudra, and they are used to indicate the nature and the functions of each Buddhist deity. In this case, what we are seeing is the mudra, which is called in Japanese Semui-in, and in Sanskrit Abhaya mudra. It is performed with the right hand lifted with the palm facing out. This gesture grants protection to the believers, and it bestows fearlessness upon them. It is believed to be the gesture that the Buddha made immediately after attaining the enlightenment. With the other hand, the left one, which is pointed downwards with the palm facing out, Buddha is performing the gesture called Yogan-in in Japanese, or Varada Mudra in Sanskrit. This gesture generally represents the granting of wishes to those who welcome the teaching of Buddhism. However, when it is being performed by the historical Buddha, such as in the sculpture that we are looking at right now, it symbolizes the summoning of heavens to witness his enlightenment. If we think of the previous two sculptures which we have seen today and the sculpture that we are looking at now, we can realize that both before and after attaining the enlightenment, Siddharta was never represented as a regular human being nor as a regular child. In fact, he was always represented with some features, some characteristics that kind of marked him as different from other human beings. In general, the characteristic in sculptures that mark him as Buddha are either tied to his life story or are simple bodily features that it is said that he was born with. So let's look at our statue of Buddha Tathāgata and look for some of these characteristics. Let's start by looking at some bodily features that are tied to his life story. For example, one element that we should note are his elongated lobes. In fact, when living at the palace, growing up, Siddharta wore precious jewelry which included heavy earrings. And when he decided to live courtly life, he gave up on such luxurious garments and he removed the earrings. However, his earlobes had stretched by the wearing of the heavy earrings, and so this sign of his kind of previous life or a previous part of his life remained physically impressed in his body. Siddharta, of course, when leaving the palace, also gave up on luxurious clothing and opted for simple robes. And in statues such as the one that we are looking at, he is shown wearing such basic robes. He also sports a tonsure, a bald head, and it is said that he had shaved himself when he decided to leave his palace. Some texts note that the remaining hair actually formed small curls that turned toward the right on his head. And in some artistic traditions, these curls developed into rows of small bumps on his head, and we can see that this was the case in the sculpture that we are looking at. Generally, Buddha is also characterized by the 32 signs of a great man as well as 80 additional characteristics, which, as we mentioned, distinguish him from normal people. Now, not all of these are physical characteristics, so not all of them can be represented in sculpture. For example, they may have to do with having a very pleasant voice. And of the ones that can be represented in sculpture, it was up to the sculptor to decide which ones to feature in a work. For example, in the sculpture that we are looking at, we can notice a cranial protuberance called Ustisha, which is one of these 32 signs of a great man, and also delicate hands and fingers were ones of the characteristic attributed to Buddha. Despite opposing the idea at first, eventually Buddha resolved to teach his own findings to others, to the population at large, and ended up spending the rest of his life traveling and teaching. So let's look at a sculpture of Buddha preaching. This is a rather simple sculpture. We can see that it's made in bronze and it's not too curvy, there aren't such extreme volumes. Buddha's body is covered by thick robes, a thick textile which drape at regular intervals all the way down, and it flows down covering the pedestal. The face is also round and rather simple, featuring a focused expression. Buddha's hands are posed in the mudra known as Dharma Chakra, or in Japanese, Tenborin-in. The right hand is held with the palm turned outwards in front of his chest, and his thumb and forefinger are joined. The right hand faces inwards, and also in this case the thumb and the index finger are joined. This gesture symbolizes teaching, and in fact it is said that it was used by Shakyamuni Buddha when preaching his first sermon after his enlightenment. This moment is said to have set in motion the turning of the wheel of the Dharma, which basically means that the spread of the Buddhist doctrine throughout Asia had started in that moment. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I also want to briefly talk about Buddha's teachings, or what are the basic ideas of the Buddhist religion. In his teachings, Buddha explained 4 noble truths. Now, I'm going to read a little bit because it's kind of hard for me to remember everything and explain it well. So let's start. The first truth is that life is suffering. The suffering may come from sickness, grief, or the death of a beloved one, or simply by being unable to obtain what one wants in life. The second truth is that suffering is caused by craving, and craving fuels suffering in a way that wood fuels fire. In fact, craving spreads rapidly. It constantly becomes attached to new objects, and it consumes what it feeds on without ever being satisfied. We have to note that with the word craving, Buddha indicates some desire that has become negative in some sense. For example, usually by being excessive or wrongly directed. It does not include all desires. For example, positive desires such as improving oneself or striving to attain nirvana are not considered negative forms of craving. The underlying understanding of the universe and life in Buddhism is cyclical. So, for example, we can understand that just like craving only gives rise to further craving, an unsatisfied life only gives rise after death to another life, fueling in this way the cycle of rebirth, and making it so that individuals are born again and again. The third truth is that suffering and rebirth can both have an end. When craving is removed, suffering ceases and nirvana is finally attained, therefore ending the cycle of rebirth, ending the samsara. And finally, the fourth truth is that there is a path which leads to the end of suffering, a way to attain the nirvana. This is known as the Eightfold Path because it consists of 8 factors to follow. Or it is also called the Middle Way because it steers a course between a life of indulgence and a life of harsh austerity. As we remember, Buddha had experienced both before gaining the enlightenment. And these 8 ideas that one must strive for to attain enlightenment are right understanding, right resolve, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right meditation. I will not go into detail about all of these because I'm afraid the video will become too long, but I recommend that you read, for example, Buddhism, a very short introduction if you want to learn more about this topic. We need to know that striving to live according to these 8 factors will actively, practically transform one's being into becoming a Buddha. So Buddha attained what is called the nirvana in this life at the age of 35, and as we mentioned, he spent the following decades traveling on foot and teaching what he had discovered. He passed away at the age of 80 due to natural causes. We can see a striking depiction of Buddha's passing, which is located in the Hōryūji temple in Nara, and it is dated to the Nara period. At Hōryūji, some caves were dug out, and the clay that was dug out of the ground was used to create 4 tableaux which depict scenes from the life of Buddha. The scene which was made to represent his passing shows Buddha lying down on his right side. He's surrounded by disciples. In fact, he had asked all his disciples to gather around him to ask them if they had any last questions remaining for him. And actually no one did, because Buddha had taught everything that he could during the last decades. As Buddha passes away, we can see the reactions on his disciples. We can see grief and desperation, which is represented in an honest, realistic, and striking display of these emotions. On the other hand, we can see the golden sculpture which represents Buddha, who emanates a peaceful attitude. In Buddha's own words, decay is inevitable in all things. And as he passed, Buddha reached a final form of nirvana known as parininrvana, which constitutes the end of rebirth and suffering, and is achieved after the physical death of the body. I think that this is truly a sculptural masterpiece, especially in the striking depiction of the Buddha's disciples and their honest reaction to his death. And so on this kind of sadder note, but still on this outstanding work of art, I'd like to conclude today's video. I hope that you enjoyed it. As always, thanks for watching, and keep in mind that you can feel free to write your thoughts or questions in the comments down below. You can subscribe to the channel if you want to see more video, and let me know if you are interested in this kind of videos about Buddhist art. I intend to do some more. And of course, if you feel like you learned something today, you can consider sending me a tip to the website Ko-Fi. The link is in the description of this video. But for now, just thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye!